Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
Now do it good. Tell this episode just like we should.
Have you seen the thing that they're now starting to use these hot millennial songs that were wildly inappropriate, and they're now starting to put them in dishwasher commercials or laundry detergent commercials? Yeah. Because they know that all of us millennials will be like, oh hey, 1998, we hear you.
Yeah,
we hear you.
Yeah, it's cool. It is what it is. And so today, you guys, Chelsea and I want to give you a big fat apology ahead of time, because this case takes place in Poland, and I am not a good language person, and so we're gonna be on the struggle bus for this episode.
I wish you guys understood how much anxiety it gives me when I see that a case is going to be taking place in anywhere other than South Mississippi. Well, I'm just my pronunciation of things, I'm the most illiterate, ignorant sounding person.
We're just little Mississippi bumpkins. You have to remember, we have humble origins, and it shows in cases like this. So just love us through it. We are doing our best. And the other thing, this is going to show just how stupid I really am. Everyone's like, oh, you girls are so smart and articulate. You should see me trying to type this episode up, because there's this piece we're going to get into that has to do with philosophy. And on a super serious note, I wonder if anybody else struggles with this, but anytime I start diving into philosophers and different philosophy theories, I'm just I'm dumb. I am dumb, capital DUMB, because I don't understand what they're talking about most of the time.
I don't know. I kind of jive with that stuff. I enjoy that stuff.
They're like, the meaning of meaning is meaningless unless meaning means something. And I'm like, what the fuck are you guys talking about? You know what I mean?
It's that's probably, what's his name? Nietzsche. I don't know how to pronounce any of their names. That's where
you and me both, but we're going to be talking about it because I added in some of the psychological pieces in this.
Oh. But this is going to be a shout out to Ellie, our girl Ellie. She actually sent this case to me, a year ago, and Chelsea and I have just gotten around to getting through it.
Oh, I love your friend Ellie.
I know, Ellie's the best.
I love
she
your
got
friend.
Married. Congratulations, happy wedding, Ellie.
Yay, Ellie.
Yay. Yeah. All right, well, somewhere between philosophy and murder.
Yeah.
This is where this case lands.
Welcome to episode number whatever we're on. We've got to be over 100.
For sure. And without further ado, this is the murder of Dariusz Janiszewski. How a novel solved a murder.
So in the far southwestern edge of Poland, miles from the nearest city, the Oder River bends sharply, forming a quiet, secluded inlet, rarely disturbed by anything but wind and water. And it's a place that mostly fishermen visit. On the morning of December 10th, 2000, that tranquil calm that usually accompanies this area was ruptured. 3 friends were out fishing in the river when one of them noticed something drifting near the shore. At first, he thought it was just some debris in the current, but as he stepped closer, something about the texture seemed off, too soft, too human. He called over to one of the others, who used the end of his fishing rod to nudge the object. It was a human body. Naturally freaked out, the three men called police and waited for them to arrive. When Polish police arrived, they found the body of the man tangled in the reeds. But it didn't appear to be an accidental drowning, as what was initially questioned. The man's hands had been bound behind his back with a noose tightly fastened around his neck. But what's even more haunting is that there was a second piece of rope that had been used to tie the man's wrists to the noose around his neck. It was kind of like a reverse hog tie. It forced the man into a backwards arch that would have tightened at every move or struggle the man made, essentially turning his ties into a self-tightening contraption until he slowly suffocated to death. New nightmare unlocked. When they pulled the body from the water, it was almost bare, just a sweatshirt and a pair of underwear clinging to skin that had been battered by time and torment. This was no simple killing. This was cruelty stretched out over time. Intentional, methodical, sadistic. The pathologist's findings only deepened the horror. The man had been starved, his stomach nearly empty, suggesting days of deprivation before his death. And his injuries told a clear story. This wasn't someone who died quickly or painlessly. He had been made to suffer. At first, investigators assumed the river was just a dumping ground, somewhere remote and quiet to discard a body after the killing had already taken place. But the autopsy told a more horrifying truth. Signs of ligature strangulation were present, strong enough to suggest that's what ultimately ended his life. But then came the twist. There was water in his lungs. That meant he was still breathing, still alive when he hit the river. In the end, the coroner couldn't rule out drowning, which meant the final moments of Dariusz Janiszewski's life may have been even more agonizing than anyone first imagined. Bound, weakened, and sinking beneath freezing water alone.
At first, police had nothing to go on. There was no wallet, there was no ID, no name, just a body that was bound and discarded in the river. But when they ran a description through their missing persons database, tall, long hair, piercing blue eyes, something pinged. The features were eerily similar to a report filed nearly a month earlier. In November, a woman had reported her husband missing. 35-year-old Dariusz Janiszewski as an advertising executive from Wrocław, a bustling city about 60 miles from the riverbank where the body had surfaced. He had vanished on November 13th, last seen leaving his modest firm in the heart of downtown, and seemed to, after that point, vanish into thin air. The police needed a family member to confirm the remains as those of Dariusz Janiszewski. They contacted his wife, but she was obviously too horrified and overwhelmed with grief to identify him, so they ended up contacting Dariusz's mother, and she didn't need long for an identification. The man's hair and the birthmark on his chest left no doubt, and she did positively identify the remains in the Oder River as her son, Dariusz Janiszewski. Now that they had a name, police dove headfirst into the investigation, in some ways quite literally. Divers braved the freezing waters of the Oder, plunging beneath the icy surface in search of evidence. Forensics teams swept the forested banks, combing through pine needles and tangled brush for anything the killer might have left behind. Detectives worked around the clock, conducting dozens of interviews. But the deeper they dug into Darius's life, the more the case seemed to slip through their fingers. There were no obvious enemies, no financial troubles that they could find, no criminal past. His marriage, though reportedly strained at one point, had reportedly stabilized. He and his wife had even begun the process to adopt a child. To those who knew him, Darius was a quiet man, a gentle presence. He played guitar in a local rock band, and his wife simply said he wasn't the kind of man to provoke anyone. He wouldn't hurt anybody. And yet someone had gone to terrifying lengths to hurt him. Months passed, and leads dried up. The investigation stalled, and by mid-2001, the police closed the case due to, quote, an inability to find the perpetrator or perpetrators. And so with no arrests, no justice, and no answers, Darius's family did the only thing they could. They erected a wooden cross on an old oak tree near the inlet where his body had been found. A quiet, weathered tribute to a brutal murder that the media would later refer to as perfect. 3 years had passed, the case had gone cold, but in 2003, one man would decide to breathe life back into it.
When Detective Jacek Wroblewski, which I'm going to refer to with every ounce of respect that I have as Detective W. Now, Detective W wasn't your stereotypical homicide cop. No swagger, no spotlight. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of investigator who wore button-ups and slacks, not a badge and a sidearm, and who had an obsession with not just solving crimes, but understanding the why behind them. Ooh, I like him already. He hadn't worked the original investigation, but something about Darius's death gnawed him. So Detective W did what few others had done. He read everything, every interview, every report, every overlooked footnote. He didn't skim, he studied. And the more he read, the more unsettled he became. The starvation, the binding, the backwards cradled rope position. This wasn't just a killing. It almost felt like it was ritualistic or a ritual, a punishment even. He noted there had been no signs of sexual assault, no robbery. Darius's wallet and credit cards were never used, and yet the killer had stripped him, starved him, and tortured him. It wasn't about sex. It wasn't about money. It was about domination, humiliation, power, maybe. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted Darius dead. They wanted him broken. Then Detective W noticed something that had been brushed aside in the original files. Darius's mobile phone. It had never been recovered, and just like that, he had a new starting point. One tiny detail, one missing object that spurred Detective W forward in reinvestigating this cold case. After poring through hundreds of pages, Detective W found something interesting. It was an initially innocuous note outlining a phone call that Darius's mother had received. Darius' mother had told investigators 3 years prior that while she was working as a bookkeeper in her son's firm, she had received a call the morning that her son disappeared. A man had called Darius's office wanting to speak with Darius himself. He was wanting 3 advertising signs made in which one of them was billboard-sized. When Darius's mother asked the man for his contact information and further details, he simply said he didn't want to speak with her. He only wanted to speak with Darius. She gave him Darius's cell number, and the anonymous man hung up. Sometime later, witnesses saw Darius leaving his office where 2 individuals were waiting for him outside. The 3 individuals left the venue together, and this was the last known contact before Darius's disappearance.
Detective Wroblewski had a knack for spotting the cracks, those tiny inconsistencies that most people overlooked. And one detail in the cold case file wouldn't let go of him. It was a note by investigators when they spoke again to Darius's mother when she recalled the last time that she spoke to her son. In this phone call that Chelsea mentioned a second ago, Darius's mother mentioned a dull, low roar in the background, like traffic, like the kind of ambient noise you'd hear from a street corner. And that struck Detective W. He knew that public payphones often carried that telltale sound. So, as a good detective that he was, he pulled the phone records from nearby payphones. And there it was. A call had been made from a payphone just down the block from Darius's office at 9:30 that morning on the day that Darius disappeared. Not even a minute later, another call was placed to Darius's personal cell phone from that same phone booth. And finally, something solid to follow, a clue that had been overlooked but seemed promising to Detective W at this point. And there was still one glaring hole in the original investigation, going back to Darius's cell phone that, again, had never been recovered. The original police team had tried, but the technology at the time was limited, and their resources even more so. But Detective W wasn't working with the same toolkit. He was part of a new wave of investigators interested in digital forensics. He brought in a telecommunications expert for help. They ended up tracing the phone's IMEI number, which is just kind of like a unique code embedded in every device. And despite the time that had passed, they got a hit. The phone had actually been used after the timeline that they had determined of when Darius was murdered. The phone had passed through several hands over the years, but Detective W tracked its trail back to the very first sale, which happened just 4 days after Dariusz Janiszewski had vanished. Now, that alone was strange, right? Who executes a methodical, torturous murderer and covers their tracks so carefully, only to turn around and sell the victim's phone online? Well, come to find out, the listing had been posted on Allegro, which is kind of like Poland's eBay. The username was Chris B and the number of 7 in brackets. Detective W traced the account and landed on a name, Krystian Bala. 30 years old, super smart dude, articulate, a former philosophy student with a master's degree and a passport full of stamps. He had run a small cleaning company for a while, and he was cultured, educated, and, on paper, kind of unremarkable. But to Detective W, something just felt off about this guy. So he kept digging. And that's when he found, buried in the noise, hiding in plain sight, the biggest piece to this case. Bala had recently published a novel titled Amok.
At first, police couldn't get to Krystian Bala. He wasn't in Poland. He'd been traveling abroad since 2001, bouncing around Asia and living the kind of transient life that made him hard to pin down. So instead, Detective W turned his attention to Bala's digital footprint, where he discovered his personal blog that he had been using to promote the novel called Amok, sharing pieces of it online. At first glance, Bala's book read like fiction, but it quickly became apparent that this book was dark, violent, explicit, kind of like the humor that Bailey likes, but I don't.
I don't like that kind of humor, though.
No, Bailey definitely doesn't like that one. She draws the line at that one. The kind of narrative that left you with a bad taste in your mouth. The protagonist of the book was a man named Chris, a jaded, self-important intellectual who drank heavily, used women, and spiraled through life with a mix of entitlement and contempt. He was arrogant, philosophical, emotionally detached, and was obsessed with an ex. It was clear to investigators reading these excerpts from Bala's book that he was obviously just kind of a weird dude. But as they got deeper into this book, things got real, like the scary type of real fast. And that pivotal point was when they came across one particular part of the book. Chris strangles his lover with a rope, tightens it with his own hands, then, to cover his tracks, he sells the murder weapon online. It stopped investigators in their tracks because they'd seen this before. The real victim, Dariusz Janiszewski, had been found with a rope around his neck, his hands bound behind him. In the final nail, his phone had been sold online by someone using the screen name Chris B7. The rope, the strangulation, the online sale, the name, it was all there in the book. From that moment, a MOOC wasn't literature, it was evidence. Investigators stopped reading for plot and started reading for proof. Page by page, it became impossible to ignore. The motive of the story, jealousy. The behavior, alcohol abuse, manipulation, womanizing, and obsession with abstract philosophy. Right? Super bizarre. Even bizarre throwaway details like a stolen church relic mirrored things from Bala's real life. And then, buried in a chapter like a landmine, came the line that cracked the case wide open. Chris says, almost in passing, that he once killed a man. Not a central point, just a flash of ego. A line meant to provoke. But to Detective W, it was no throwaway. It was the truth hiding in plain sight. This wasn't fiction spun from imagination. It was a confession, dressed in metaphor bold enough to be published. Bala hadn't just written a novel. He had written the story of a murder and left his fingerprints on every page. Detective W was no longer unraveling a cold case. He was reading the killer's manuscript, and it could only have been written by the man who lived it. So now Detective W couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. This was something deeper, spinning myth into narrative, daring someone to untangle the truth. Krystian Bala now became a prime suspect for the death of Dariusz Janiszewski. So with a prime suspect, they dug. They found that Krystian Bala had once been a top philosophy student. He was brilliant yet rebellious and was absolutely obsessed with thinkers like Nietzsche and Wittgenstein.
So you guys know I have to nerd out throughout these episodes when we start getting into psychological stuff, right? And I had to, because remember at the beginning how I was like, I'm not the smartest cookie when it comes to deep philosophical things. So I had to really look into this and research some of this to better try to understand the mind of Krystian Bala. And when looking at these idols, let's do it one step at a time. So good old Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a German philosopher who believed that traditional religion, especially Christianity, was losing its cultural power. With its decline, people needed to find new sources of meaning. And so he envisioned a new kind of individual who creates their own values and meaning in life, rising above herd mentality. Now, I don't know if you guys remember this, but Chelsea, do you remember that movie Can't Hardly Wait?
Yes.
And there's one scene where I think Preston is talking to one of the girls in the kitchen, and she was like, they're all sheep, and she's cutting up the plastic things that go on, and she was like, all of you are sheep, bah, bah. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
So that's what it makes me think of, is rising above herd mentality, right? So back to our boy Nietzsche. He believed at the core of human nature is a drive not for survival or pleasure, but for power and dominance. He was also a nihilist, which is basically a belief that nothing really matters. There's no real meaning, no higher purpose, and no solid truth that you can count on. It's pretty sad. People who lean into this mindset often feel like life is pointless, that values like right and wrong are just made up rules. A true nihilist doesn't believe in anything, not love, not morality, not even the idea that life has value. At its core, it's a worldview soaked in hopelessness and sometimes a desire to tear everything down just to prove a point.
Like, I hate to say it, but it really does make me think of, like, it's not a phase, Mom. Like, you're just, like, living in your, like, depression cave, and you're, like, reading Friedrich Nietzsche, whatever his name is, right? I get it. He probably is a great philosopher or whatever, but come on.
But that's what I mean. It's just, some of this stuff is just so, I see it differently as a therapist, right? Because literally I said, this sounds like a breeding ground for psychopaths posing as philosophers.
Right? Exactly.
There's no meaning in life. It's all despair. It doesn't matter. Right and wrong's not a thing. And I'm like, quite literally, I think if a psychopath were to write a manifesto, that's what he would say.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what's interesting, what's fascinating about this piece is that in Bala's book, Amok, the main character, Chris, tends to echo this concept of nihilism, mocking morality, drifting through life without purpose, and treating people as tools. Again, really gives off this like psychopathic vibes. As far as Ludwig Wittgenstein, well, he was an Austrian philosopher that believed that language limits thought. So basically, if something can't be clearly expressed in language, it's meaningless, at least philosophically speaking. And as far as Amok's Chris, well, he goes on long, deep-sounding rants that seem smart and philosophical, talking like he's searching for truth in a world that doesn't make sense. But if you really break it down, it's mostly him talking to himself in circles. And the irony here is that kind of self-absorbed, confusing language is exactly the kind of thing that Wittgenstein later said was useless. Because if no one else can understand you, then what's the point? And so basically what I put in all caps was, Krystian Bala is the worst.
I feel like Bailey's gonna have like a 12-month calendar or like a 36-month calendar entitled You're the Worst, and it's gonna be like all these characters that we've come across in these cases, right? Like, I just feel like every so often you're just like, and you belong in that category of you're the worst.
Yeah, you win the trophy for the worst. So what I've learned by leaning into Bala's favorite philosophers is that he believed that reality was flexible, language was just a game, and that there was no such thing as objective truth, only interpretation. He called it, quote, mytho-creativity.
Of course he had his own. Of course he made up his own words.
Oh, of course he made up his own words. And it's the idea that if you told a story well enough, it became real. That is not how this works. Bala had taken the belief and molded it into his identity. He wasn't just writing amok, he was amok, which in my book as a therapist means you're likely self-absorbed, struggle with narcissistic tendencies, and highly manipulative. Bala blurred the line between author and narrator, even posting excerpts on a blog under the same name, responding to comments as, quote, Chris, which, again, really speaks to the delusion this man was operating under. The dude was troubled, and his fictional novel was showing just how unhinged he was.
So he writes a book with the main character as himself, but is a fictional character, and he's responding to people's comments as himself under his fictional main character title.
Yes. Hashtag nailed it.
Hashtag I'm a philosopher.
Oh gosh. Yeah, for real.
Guess that's all it takes. Detective W began reading the novel not as a detective, but a profiler, trying to understand Bala's mind, which could potentially lead to identifying real-life patterns. Detective W began assigning chapters of the book to members of his team, telling them to look for codes, patterns, any real-world parallels that they might see. Simultaneously, Detective W began to dig into Krystian Bala's background as well. He discovered that Bala's academic record was stellar. He graduated from one of the local universities with the highest possible marks and enrolled in a PhD program shortly after. But despite his intellect, there was a recklessness to him. While classmates crammed for exams, Bala would stay out all night drinking and then waltz in hungover and still outperform everyone. Pretty sure that he might have been my husband's roommate, because that's exactly how my husband's roommate was in pharmacy school.
Lucky.
Right? All of this nighttime drinking and coming in hungover and still outperforming everyone, that was another parallel to Chris and Amok. Bala had a certain charisma, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Friends called him Amour for his looks and charm, but behind the charm, there was a lot of detachment. Again, another parallel to Chris and Amok. At home, Krystian Bala was equally contradictory. He married his high school sweetheart, Stasia, and they had a son together. But the marriage quickly soured. His wife would later say that the main issue was women, plural. Like, what do we have here? Another parallel to Chris and Amok? Weird, right? Affairs, detachment, and eventually a complete emotional disappearance was what Detective W discovered looking into Bala's life. Bala had eventually walked away from both his PhD and his marriage, starting a business that failed as quickly as it launched. When it all collapsed, he left Poland, first for the US, then to Asia, teaching scuba diving in English to scrape by. But during that time, he began writing Amok, his attempt at real-life chaos posing as ideology.
Now, Krystian Bala didn't just talk about chaos, he lived for it. In 1999, he came back to Poland and appeared in a documentary about young entrepreneurs. He showed up in a sharp suit, clean-shaven, looking the part. But when he spoke, he didn't really sound like a businessman. He was more kind of like someone who'd lost faith in the world. Bala stopped believing in things like marriage and work or right and wrong. He loved breaking the mold and started making up stories about his life, affairs, adventures, and big ideas. If enough people believed him, that was good enough. Truth didn't matter. But then something changed. The stories got darker, and he became obsessed with pushing limits, doing things that most people wouldn't even consider doing. For some, that might mean deep thinking or risk-taking, but for Bala, it meant sex, drugs, and violence. He bragged that he could do anything, that he wouldn't live long, but he'd live fast and hard. At Amok, most people thought it was just a twisted novel, but not Detective W. Though he wasn't a literary critic, as he kept turning the pages of the book, the more he grew convinced that Krystian Bala was their guy. The parallels that Chelsea talked about between the book and Krystian Bala were astonishing, at least to the detectives. Both were former philosophy students, both had run businesses that had failed, both had wives who had left them, both drank too much, traveled extensively, and flirted with self-destruction. But the nail in the coffin for Detective Wroblewski was the excerpt from a muck where, after killing his girlfriend, Chris casually says, "I sold the knife on an internet auction." Just like earlier, it was likely meant as a throwaway line, not necessarily central to the plot. But in real life, Darius's phone had been sold in exactly the same way. But the crucial part is that this detail had never been made public. Now, there's more proof, arguably, that Bala was directly connected to the murder of Dariusz.
However, Detective W also knew that all of this was circumstantial. Literary coincidences don't make a murder conviction. He needed proof. Solid, irrefutable proof. So what does he do? He does what he does best, and he digs. He dug deeper into Bala's digital footprint yet again. What he found was that weeks before Dariusz's disappearance, Bala had visited an online auction for a police manual titled, are you ready for this? Accidental, Suicidal, or Criminal Hanging. It was a book that described in detail how to bind a person in ways that mimicked self-inflicted hanging, like the backward rope configuration found on Dariusz's body. Still, there was no direct link. No fingerprint, no DNA, right? I mean, it was just a lot of theories. It really was only a mounting storm of circumstantial clues. As detectives worked to reconstruct a clear timeline, what they called a logical chain of evidence, they stumbled onto a small but crucial detail: a prepaid magnetic phone card. It was the card used to contact Dariusz Janiszewski on the very day that he disappeared. At first, it was just a number, but once they dug into its call history, the pattern became impossible to ignore. That same card had been used more than 30 times to call a handful of other numbers connected to Krystian Bala's life. His office, his parents, his girlfriend. The web was starting to form, but what really tightened the noose was what they found when they looked into Bala's personal life around the time of the murder. In 1999 and 2000, everything in Bala's personal life was unraveling. His business had collapsed, his marriage to Stasia had fallen apart, and even though he had cheated on her multiple times, he couldn't seem to let her go. Worse, he was jealous and possessive and unwilling to see her move on. When police finally got Stasia to talk, she hesitated at first, but eventually admitted something unexpected. Stasia, Bala's wife, she had had a brief fling with none other than Dariusz Janiszewski. And according to those close to Bala, Bala knew. He knew about the affair. Now, detectives had more than a connection. They had a motive. Witnesses came forward with stories of Bala's jealousy boiling over. One of the most damning came from a New Year's Eve party in 2000. Bala saw his estranged wife talking to another man and completely lost it. We're talking level 7 meltdown. He started yelling, furious, irrational, accusations, right? According to the witnesses, he screamed at the man that he would, quote, get rid of him, and that he had already done it before, quote, with a rope.
Now, things are not looking good for Krystian Bala, but Detective W knew better than to rush a case this strange. He needed more evidence, a little bit more time, and a lot more control. And most importantly, he needed the moment to be perfect. Although Bala had been living abroad, he still came back to Poland now and then to visit family, tie up loose ends, and, continue living his life. So Detective W made a plan that was low-key but precise. His team was careful because they did not want any media leaks. They didn't want to put any pressure on Bala's friends or family. Basically, they didn't want to spook him. The next time Krystian Bala set foot on Polish soil, they would be ready. And that moment came in September of 2005. Bala had returned, unaware that every step he made was being watched. Detective W had been tracking him for days, waiting for the right place, the right time, and just the right window to make their move. And then on September 5th, Bala stepped out of a drugstore on Legnica Street. What happened next now depends on who you ask. Krystian Bala would go on to claim that 3 men approached him out of nowhere. One twisted his arms behind his back, another one grabbed his throat so he couldn't scream, and he could barely breathe. Within seconds, he was shoved into a dark green vehicle, and then someone pulled a plastic bag over his head, and he thought he was being kidnapped. Maybe it was for a ransom. He tried to explain that he didn't have any money, but no one responded. He was driven through the city, destination unknown, and dragged into a building. Sounds like something out of a movie, and if that's really how the Polish police arrest people, then, I guess that's like a hard flex, right?
Right, like good on them. Sometimes it'd be like that.
It'd be like that. And the building that he was drug into was the police department. And it was not a ransom setup, it was an arrest. And the man waiting for him inside was none other than Detective Jacek Wroblewski. Now, cool thing is they named him Jack Sparrow because I think Jacek or Jacek in Polish translates to Jack in English. And something about the sparrow I don't exactly remember, but basically everybody called him Jack Sparrow. And of course, this was the same man who had spent years untangling the lies that Krystian Bala thought were impenetrable. Bala quickly realized that this was not a kidnapping, and I don't know what gave it away, whether it was the detectives or the whole-ass police department that he was sitting in. He realized he wasn't being held by thugs, he was in police custody. And the guy sitting across from him was not there to negotiate. He was there to confront him with something more dangerous, arguably, than a ransom. It was the truth behind a brutal, unsolved murder. Detective W launched straight into it, questioning Bala about the murder of Dariusz Janiszewski. Bala literally laughed and said, "You think I'd write about a murder I actually committed?" He scoffed. "That's absurd."
But this wasn't about a single scene in a novel anymore. Detective W laid it all out. He's like, dude, we have the phone records tied to the prepaid card, the auction listing where Janiszewski's phone was sold, the disturbing step-by-step similarities between the book Amok and the real-life murder, and lest us not forget about the manual about hanging that is literally bookmarked in Bala's computer. This wasn't guesswork, it was a web, and Bala was at the center of it. I mean, I guess technically at this point, Bala's more like the fly that kind of gets, like wrapped up by the little spider.
Right.
But a web nonetheless. Still, no confession. Which, I mean, does that surprise anybody? Like, Bala's not going to confess. They would literally have a picture of him and he'd be like, dude, what? What? Bruh, I wasn't there. Wasn't me, man. So, not directly, right? He didn't confess directly. Instead, Bala did what he does best, and he performed. He leaned into the misunderstood genius persona, accusing the police of brutality, claiming he'd been beaten, suffocated, and kidnapped. Dear Mr. Poland Police Department. But behind the dramatics, there was something else, something more revealing. He couldn't stop yapping. Investigators would later say it felt like Bala wanted to be caught. Like he was dancing at the edge of confession just to see how close he could get without falling in. He was toying with the very idea of truth, testing how far he could stretch it before it snapped. He agreed to a polygraph test. This dude is like too much. Whatever. He agreed to a polygraph test, which would wind up being inconclusive. Detectives were still not convinced, as Bala was engaging in breathing exercises throughout the test in a clear attempt to temper his psychological responses. It's important to note here, Bala's accusation against the police weren't taken lightly. In 2006, an internal investigation was launched to examine his claims of mistreatment. The conclusion, well, there was no corroborating evidence that his version of the events actually happened. But that wouldn't stop Bala from trying to spin the story his way. After all, myth-making was what he did best. And I mean, I guess that aligns if you don't believe in any sort of truth or consequence, right?
Right.
As the investigation deepened, Detective W knew he had walked into uncharted territory. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. This was a debate over where fiction ends and truth begins. The court of public opinion was already stirring. Was it legal to use a novel as evidence in a real-life criminal case? Was this justice or a literary witch hunt? But Detective W wasn't relying solely on a MOOC. By the time the case moved forward, he had more than just eerie passages and overlapping timelines. He had hard data. He had proof that Bala had sold Dariusz's phone just days after the murder. He had evidence that Bala had researched methods of hanging. He had motive. I mean, he kind of had the whole bag. And he had the most damning thing of all, which was Bala couldn't stop talking about the case. Investigators discovered that Bala had visited websites and forums discussing the murder. He even commented on news articles. He inserted himself into conversations about a crime he claimed to know nothing about. And yet, in those comments, he revealed knowledge that had never been public. It was the proverbial nail in the coffin. And on a side note, is true crime not a thing in Poland in the late 90s and early 2000s? Did he not watch all of these, America Most Wanted type of shows? Does he not know that you can't do that?
I mean, I think it just goes back to his personality. If he really is as arrogant and egotistical as, all of the reporting made it seem, then inserting himself in an investigation, making comments nobody's gonna, put this two and two together. And I am so incredibly genius that I don't even know how I can walk around with my huge cranium attached to my head. You know what I mean?
Right. I know. He's like, how you like me now? And everybody's like, dude, you literally logged in and posted it yourself. We know what you're doing, friend.
You have your IP address with a facial recognition for your comments. In 2007, Krystian Bala went to trial. The prosecution laid out their case thread by thread: the timeline, the phone, the auction site, the travel records, and his shitty novel, Amok. They argued that Bala had orchestrated the murder, then written it into fiction, believing himself too clever, too literary, too untouchable to ever be caught. He is absolutely on my top 5 of the worst people next to Danilo Restivo, the mouth-breathing, hair-collecting killer.
Mouth breathing. We need to have kind of like those kids' books where you can push a button and it sounds like them,
Yeah.
right? And his is going to be like, oh, no, no.
Yeah. The defense fired back. They claimed that Bala was being persecuted for his art, that his novel was provocative, sure, but nothing more than a work of imagination, and the similarities between the novel and the actual crime were vague. They pointed out that the victim in the book was a woman, not a man like Dariusz Janiszewski. The MO was different, and the story itself is messy, abstract, and hard to follow. I thought you guys just said that he was being persecuted for his art. Doesn't sound like art. The defense shot back at the prosecution for thinking that the book was a confession in disguise. They continued their argument saying that this was not a confession in disguise. It was just dark fiction that happened to kind of echo real events. They pointed to the fact that there was no DNA evidence tied him to the crime, there were no eyewitnesses, there was no confession, and they even brought in experts who warned of the dangers of equating author with narrator. One of the expert witnesses even said, quote, "Writers invent, writers provoke. If this becomes a precedent, any controversial novel could be weaponized." But the prosecution didn't need the book to be a confession. They only needed it to show a pattern. And they had something even stronger, the behavioral consistency of Krystian Bala. He didn't just write like a narcissist, he acted like one. He inserted himself into the investigation. He fed off of the media attention, and he hinted at things no innocent man would hint at. He literally made himself the center of the story, both literally and figuratively speaking. And then there was the psychological profile. Experts who analyzed both the novel, Amok, and Bala himself described traits consistent with psychopathy: a grandiose sense of self, a shallow affect, manipulative behavior, and a dangerous lack of empathy. To them, the book wasn't a mask, it was a mirror. And apparently, this was enough for the court. After weeks of testimony and debate, the verdict was read. Krystian Bala was guilty, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the torture and murder of Dariusz Janiszewski.
The conviction of Krystian Bala was more than just a legal win. It was a cultural shockwave. For years, Bala had operated in this blurred space between fact and fiction. In Poland, the trial became a turning point in how digital trails, narrative patterns, and psychological profiling were used in criminal investigations. Bala wasn't caught through traditional means. Again, there were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no smoking gun. He was caught because he couldn't resist the urge to turn a real murder into a performance, and that arrogance became his undoing.
Even now, behind bars, Krystian Bala maintains his innocence. He still plays the role of the misunderstood intellectual, the artist wrongfully condemned. But the evidence, painstakingly uncovered over years, tells another story. One about a man who wrote the perfect crime and then got caught trying to sell it. And that, my dear friends, is the wildly stranger than fiction case of the murder of Dariusz Janiszewski.
So, Bailey, how common is this type of behavior with the clients that you work with? Because I know that people that kind of are on that spectrum of psychopathy are some of your, I don't know, I feel like you enjoy working with those clients, right? Like you enjoy almost like the challenge of it, right?
Yeah.
When administering therapy.
Yeah.
I mean, is that pretty par for the course? Kind of how he was acting.
I don't necessarily would go as far as saying the psychopathy. I mean, I have worked with like legitimate psychopaths who scored off the charts on the psychopathy checklist. And that I think is maybe a little bit different. But yeah, I mean, especially when I did private practice, my specialty and what I became known for in the clinical community was working with narcissists. Kind of just like as a fun fact, a side story, I worked with this client. I want to call him a kid, but he's not. He was, college age. And he came to me for compulsive sexual behavior, for sex addiction. And he absolutely met the criteria. He absolutely had compulsive sexual behaviors. He was pretty resistant to treatment. He had a lot of denial. And he was also a narcissist, which I diagnosed him with because he met full criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. And, he ended up leaving, going back to college. And 7 months later, I get a text on my private practice number. And we'll call him Bob. And Bob texted me and said, hey, Miss Bailey, I am back in town for spring break and I'd like to have a session with you. I wanted to pick your brain about something. And I said, hey, Bob, really good to hear from you. But that's, unfortunately, that's not how it works. I mean, if you want to come back and go through the assessment process again, we can do that. But I don't just do one-off sessions. And he said, because at the time I charged $160 an hour. And he said, come on, it's easy money. I know you need it.
Oh.
And I said, well, Bob, that's not how this works. And he was like, well, can I call for a free consult? And I said, yes, Bob, that's fine. You can call for a free consult for your new presenting issue. This kid calls me up and I'm driving home from work, right? I've been doing trauma therapy all day and I have an hour drive home. And he lays into me. And this has been 7 months since I had spoken to him. And he goes through literally a bulleted list of, what do you call it? Complaints? Like, what's the word I'm looking for?
Grievances
about our time together in therapy. And so you have to remember that this is an actual diagnosed narcissist. Now, he was not a malignant narcissist, which is the ones that you can just be like, that's dumb. And they're like, yeah, you have a good point. He was a fragile narcissist, which meant that you have to handle them with kid gloves. Very, very fragile. Ego is very, very, very fragile. And so he starts reading off basically how shitty I am as a therapist. And he was like, you made the clinical recommendation for me to go to SLAW meetings, which is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And he was like, I have become kind of an expert in psychology over the last 7 months. And I Googled a lot of stuff and basically like birds of a feather flock together. And they've got like pedophiles in those meetings. And I'm glad I didn't go because you wanted me to be surrounded by pedophiles. How would that have helped me in my recovery? And you can't, like, there's no point arguing, right? So I just go, okay, okay, yeah, what's your next grievance? And he was like, that one time in session when I told you that I had sex with this woman and you made it sound like I was taking advantage of her and being manipulative, I didn't appreciate the face you made. He said, you looked like I was stupid. And I said, I am sorry you interpreted my face that way. Sometimes my face just looks that way. And he just goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And so finally I said, Bob, I gotta say, I'm really proud of you for, advocating for yourself and sharing these grievances.
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, this was, me too. And I said, yeah, I mean, it's got to be really hard to, call a therapist, somebody who's in a position of power, and basically go through a checklist of like how they suck and how they're defective like that. I'm sure a lot of people don't handle that very well.
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, absolutely. And I said, so I'm just really proud of you for, speaking your mind, because that's important. And he was like, you're right. And Miss Bailey, despite all of these grievances, I just want to let you know that you're the best therapist I've ever had, and you changed my life. And I said, Bob, that really warms my heart, and I really appreciate that. And he was like, no, really, like, I needed this conversation. It's water under a bridge. You have my respect forever, and I just, you just keep doing what you're doing because you're changing lives. And I said, Bob, I really appreciate it, and thank you so much.
Yes.
And I know that was kind of a long, drawn out story, but like that just gives you like a Polaroid of like working with narcissists, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I love them. But Chelsea and I, we love the toys that are on the island of misfit toys. And narcissists are really honestly just wounded little boys or girls.
Sure.
And if you can see, when you talk to them and look at them and you see them like a wounded child, it makes it a lot easier to swallow. And so basically all that to say, Krystian Bala probably had a lot of that. If you were to talk to him and kind of get through the bullshit and get through the bravado, you could really probably see this like little kid version inside of him. But, with that being said, not all narcissists obviously commit murder and are psychopaths. So that's a little bit different.
Sure.
But
no.
Yes, to answer your question, I love him. I love them.
Well, again, I know that you guys will probably get tired of certain things that we say, and I cannot tell you how many times I think to myself reading descriptions of perpetrators where I'm like, no offense, but this literally sounds like half of the middle school kids that I work with, right? Like it's like they just get stuck. It's like I don't know, like they get stuck in this very egocentric, just very self-indulgent, reckless, right? Like I literally watch kids and I'm like, dude, friend, sister, what are you doing? Right? And they're just like, I'm sorry, Miss Holt. I'm sorry. And I feel like that was kind of Bala. Like, I feel like if someone would have just been like, what are you doing, dude? What are you doing? Like he probably would have been like, eventually he'd have just been like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't know. I don't know, man.
Yeah, maybe.
I was just bored.
Or he was like, I am gonna eternally strip you of all of your character in an timeless work of fiction. Like, okay, Bala, shut up. Like, whatever.
And I think that's another thing that we should explore one of these days. I don't know very many like full-fledged philosophers, but let me tell you, I've had to take a couple of philosophy-based classes recently where we have to kind of go and explore some of these modern philosophers, like ones that are still alive that are
right.
I mean, I guess they're considered philosophers. I don't know how long you have to be in the field, right, to be considered a full-fledged philosopher, or you just have to have a piece of paper on the wall. But let me tell you, it's an interesting sub-genre of people.
Yeah,
and I'm kind of here for it. I'm not gonna lie, it's interesting stuff. So I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as we did. If you ever find a novel that seems to be a little bit too coincidental, maybe look into it. You might be onto something.
That's right. And as always, you guys, thanks for hanging out with us for this wild and crazy ride.
And we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.
Hey, Wildside Tribe, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildside Podcast. Make sure to tune in on Wildside Wednesdays. New episodes will drop each Wednesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We would love to hear from you, so if you have a wild case recommendation, email us at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. That's Wildside with a C. Or share your thoughts in the comments below. as always, if you haven't heard it today, you're loved, you're worthy, and you're valuable. And we'll catch you on the flip side.